Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're getting some folks in from the waiting room, and as we get them in, we'll get started here in just a few moments.
Would you like our cameras on?
Great question. So we would love cameras on. Yep, I'll do some housekeeping once we get folks in, but cameras on is great for us. And then we have a lot of folks in the call, so if you can be mindful that you are muted as well, that would be helpful for us just so we don't have any background noise throughout this meeting. So thanks for joining us. If you don't have a camera on your computer, no worries. It's just we are, everyone is new here, and so we're all just trying to get to know each other, and it's a little easier to get to know someone when you can have a face and a name rather than just, an email address across a black box. Um, which will bring me to my first point, and thank you to those of you who are joining us today. After our last two Saturdays, whether you joined us in person or online, we're really grateful for you giving us your time. One thing we're going to ask, it's what we asked if you were there, is if you wouldn't mind changing your name. Most of you are in here with your email address you registered with. You can change your name. If you go to your image, there should be a box with three little ellipses, the dot, 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 and you can click that. And then there will be a menu and you can click rename. And what we're going to ask is that you rename yourself with your name, your new title, like mayor, mayor-elect, council member, city planner, whatever, and then the community you're now representing, just so we can have a feel of who's in the call and for these conversations today. So with that said, we will go ahead and get started. If you, again, you could please keep yourself muted. We'll unmute you if we do questions. The plan right now is to do questions at the end. Meg and Carson are two kind of in-house experts on land use. Meg is our senior land use planner. Carson Eilers is our policy director, and they're going to be taking us through some good basics that follow up on our last Saturday's conversations. So with that, oh, actually, sorry, one more piece of housekeeping. We are recording this. So if you have questions that we are not able to answer, we're going to send out the recording, we're going to send out the slides, so you'll have this resource later. If you have someone from your community who was signed up but wasn't able to be here, they'll be able to watch this later. So with that, Meg and Carson, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Molly. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for spending your lunch hour with us. This is going to be a overview of some hot topics in land use. If you joined us on one of the last two Saturdays, I kind of did an overview of land use, kind of a part one, kind of the bigger picture about why we plan. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the process behind conditional use permits and then subdivisions, short-term rentals, and then housing. Some topics that we hear a lot of from our thanks. A lot of topics that we hear about throughout the state. And then we'll try to take some questions at the end, but remember that we are available to you beyond this call. And so if you don't get your question answered, you can always get your email to us on that. So last Saturday, the last two Saturdays, and sorry, we went over kind of that 3,000 foot level in land use, and I'm going to take a quick second here to review this. This is what I like to call the land use lanes, because it relates to the topics that we're going to talk about today. And that's the legislative, administrative, and quasi-judicial. We are not only walking ourselves through these steps when we're on the dais with an agenda, but we're walking the public through them. Because as I like to say, we're doing the public's business in public, and we move from one area of law to another when we have different applications before us. So that legislative, that very broad authority, very broad public input, that would be creation of a zoning ordinance. We're looking at ideas, we're deciding whether to make it law. And then we shift to administrative, where we've actually then put the law into place. So that would be the zoning code. And it's much more restrictive, and the public input is more limited. We're looking at whether the application meets the code or not. I like to say we have all this latitude with the legislative, in the legislative arena, the legislative land use lane, to create the code. And then once we shift to adopting the code, we're much more restricted. And we should, in a way, say to community members, these are the rules that we decided on collectively, and now here's how you can develop or build or do the processes in our community. Welcome to our community. We're here to say how, here's how you can meet the code, here's how it works. And then that third area, which is very narrow and restricted, which deals with appeals and variances, is that quasi-judicial arena. And that's what we call appeals and variances. Again, so just a quick reminder, legislative, administrative, quasi-judicial, that will apply to some of the terms that we talk about today. And another tip, and I mentioned this before, is a lot of folks put this on their agendas. So in other words, when you have, an application, you put whether it's legislative or administrative. So you remind yourself of the process and what lane you're in and what you're looking at, and then also the public. All right, conditional uses or CUPs. If you received the materials that we sent out to you, Molly put together a great acronym list. This is another one we like to say, a CUP. I like to say a conditional use permit is something to be carefully used and precisely. Okay, what are they? Who approves them? Do we need them? You have three types of uses in your zoning code. Permitted. So like, for example, that would be, we've decided that you're allowed to build a single family home. It's a permitted use in this zone. And here are the rules: height, setbacks, whatever it may be that you decide in your code. Prohibited. So things we don't allow in our code. And I often suggest that before you have uses in a zoning district chapter or somewhere in your code, you say, these are the uses that we allow, all other uses are prohibited. So it's clear. And remember that a zoning document is something that can be altered and changed. So you may have not envisioned a use in your code, and it's a great use for your town. So you can always amend your code to allow that. It's not one time you make the code, it's then there set for life. And then finally, we have conditional, what we're talking about now. So what does that mean, conditional? Well, this is the actual state law reference, and we cited this last week when we were talking at last two Saturdays. This is the sort of state law, Title 10, Chapter 20, that you can always reference back. Great state website where you can go and check out these codes when you need to. And this is what it actually says. So your land use ordinance, which is your zoning code, you may have a conditional use. So you don't have to have these. Okay. But if you do have them, you have to have standards. And we'll talk about what those standards are. So you have to have standards to review a conditional use written down in your code. And here's where it's sort of different from permitted or prohibited. It says it shall be approved. So it's kind of like a permitted use, right? You have to approve it if you can put conditions on it. So what does that mean? Well, and again, sorry. There we go. So, and Molly, I'm just going to interrupt here. It keeps asking me to start the video. Can I close this? I keep getting a thing on my screen.
Oh, can you start? Yeah, can you start the video and then we're good to go?
Okay, great, thanks. I just, sorry for that digression. I just had this flashing thing before me here. So let's get back to conditional use permits. So, is there a distinction between conditional and permitted? Not really. It's that shall be approved that we just looked at. that makes the sort of distinction. So that's why I like to say it's kind of like a really exceptional case where you want to use these. So who does review them? Well, the city council designates who is the land use authority that would review and approve these in each community, and that can be different in every community. So staff could approve these, planning commission could approve these. City councils may approve these depending on the size of your community, but if we go back to our land use lanes, remember these are administrative. So we are looking at the code, we have standards that we're reviewing, and we're saying, does this meet or not? And let's take an example of a conditional use. So we have a neighborhood, residential neighborhood, and someone wants to open a corner grocery store. So I'm talking candy, milk, nothing big. Hours of operation are, minimal. But we have allowed that as a conditional use. So we're saying we think it fits in the neighborhood, but we're going to take an extra level look at it. We're going to say, what do we think? How do we think this will fit in the neighborhood? And what do we use to do that review? Well, we use standards. And this is what we looked at with that section in the state code where it says you have to have standards if you have conditional uses. These standards are things you create. They are policy decisions that you create when you're in the legislative lane. Then you adopt them and put them in your code. And they can be whatever is applicable to your community. So what do I mean by that? Well, transportation might be important where you're going to have this use. Maybe that circulation pattern for our example of the neighborhood commercial in that residential zone is important to look at. Maybe it's important to look at sewer, water. Maybe it's important to look at hours of operation. Will the neighborhood store be open after 9 or 10? Do we want to perhaps limit that? Trash, emergency services, whatever that list is, you need to put those standards of review in your code. Why is this tricky? And why do I often say, if you really think you want a use in a zone, just make it permitted? Because once we have these standards written down, and let's say, for example, we're reviewing that neighborhood grocery store, and I forgot, we all forgot in our code to write down hours of operation, then could I, when I review the application, add on at the last minute hours of operation, even though the standard wasn't written down in my code? And I know you all resoundingly said no. So you could go back and amend the code, but that's why these standards are important, and you see the categories are broad, they're general. So what would fall under transportation, circulation? Well, it could be a host of things. And that's why most communities who choose to have conditional uses need to have broad standards. I would say have very limited conditional uses. Really look at that use table in each zone. We tend not to do that. A lot of communities, I think in the last decade, have really started to look at this. And I think we have some folks from Manti with us today. And I think maybe they could share in the chat what they just decided to do with conditional uses. I heard they made some changes. So again, conditional uses, careful, use precisely, have to have standards, don't have to have them. City council designates who approves them. I would recommend that since they're administrative, if you're fortunate to have staff do it, have planning commission do it. And then the other thing is, let's talk about input. So this item is administrative. There is no public hearing required for a conditional use permit. Do we want to have input? And again, why no hearing? Because again, we're in the administrative lane. We're not asking the public necessarily whether it's an idea they like, because we've already made that decision when we adopted the legislative policy. We're saying we all agreed this was a good use. Now let's see if we can make it fit within the neighborhood. Could we put hours of operation? Could we put limits on lighting? Could we figure out trash and parking? So what kind of input are you asking for? And so often there's a disconnect when we hold a public hearing for a conditional use permit, which you could do. It's not required by law. It's a local choice. But I ask you why and what you're asking for. So if it's simply input and you're looking for information that you didn't have, maybe hold it in a different way. So think about that if you are going to have conditional uses in your community. All right. That is our quick primer on conditional uses. We have lots more resources that we'll talk about on the end on that. And again, you can always contact us for questions. What's another topic we hear a lot about throughout the state and has some changes that went into an effect over the last several years is subdivisions. And I'm talking specifically about subdivision plats. So we have an ordinance that we adopt in the legislative arena that sets the standards for how we will review subdivision plats. So we have a subdivision ordinance, and then we have the process, the administrative process for reviewing and approving the plats. The changes that were made were to the process part, to the administrative part, not to the actual creation of the ordinance. And I challenge you to look at your subdivision ordinance and really have a good vision statement that sets what that community vision is in your ordinance. I often, because that's one of the first thing developers or applicants or someone who wants to do a subdivision in your community will look at. What is the vision? Are we small, rural, urban, large? Do we want diversity? Do we want cookie cutter? What is that vision for subdivisions that we want in our community? Because that sets an expectation when folks come in to look at how they could build in your community. So the process piece, which only applied to subdivisions for 1 or 2 family dwellings or townhomes, does these few things. So it sped up the process, it put a time clock on the process, and this was in the name of producing more housing units across the state. So this was an effort that Karson can speak more to, or he can interject if he likes, but there was a policy decision that we need to increase the housing supply, and by increasing the time that it takes to get the process in subdivisions would help to that end. We are pleased to say that we've had most of our communities adopt these new sort of provisions with this time clock. There are differentiations in that time clock review based on the size of your city. We have more resources on our website on this, and the next slide will also show you some folks to contact on this, because we have some leftover money from the state to help us update our ordinances in this area. We had a time clock on this, but we had a few rural communities that weren't able to meet that, but are now. And so we have some resources for you there. The big thing I'd like to mention in this process for newly elected officials is that the change made for this plat review process was that it took the city council and the planning commission out of the final stages of review for a plat. And I know in some of our smaller communities that we still have that in place. So you have to create this new term called an administrative land use authority that would then review and look at that and work with the developer based on the time clock, based on the size of your community. So some details and nuances to this, we can help you walk through it. But that's the big sort of takeaway. New rules on processing, time clock, council, planning commission. You can't be the final approval part of this process. Todd Godfrey is, I like to call him our legal guru. We contract with him to help us work on the updates to the subdivision ordinance. He also, although he hates it when I say this, he also drafted the ordinance. So we, because a lot of people, it took a little while to get used to some of the changes, but I think it's really for the best. And Todd can help you not only if you are a community that hasn't finished that final touches, he can help you with resources. He can help you think about fee resolutions to accompany some of the changes in processing. And if you can't get a hold of him, you can always contact us. And we also have more detailed resources about those two bills and more of a breakdown on our resource page at ulct.org. Short-term rentals, everyone's favorite topic throughout the state. Everyone approaches these differently. What are the few takeaways? And by short-term rentals, I think we all know typically the largest sort of players in the field are Airbnb and VRBO, but it could even just be local. Here are the takeaways for short-term rentals. You can regulate them. In the state of Utah, you can regulate them. You can pick the zone where you want them. You can put limitations on that. You can put time requirements. You can put other types of parameters on how you want those to operate. You can enforce them. This is where the limitations lie in the enforcement. And the section below that is actually the short-term rental enforcement section. If there are any questions in the state code, it is Title 10, Chapter 8, Section 85.4 on the State of Utah legislative website. Karson, my colleague here, is not happy with me for putting this up, but no, he would be happy to answer any other questions as we navigate the legislative side of this. He's been following this for years and is our point person up at Capitol Hill as we navigate, trying to figure out how we can do enforcement in a maybe easier way. The limitations on that enforcement simply mean that you cannot just enforce by using a website listing. What do I mean by that? As a city, I can't just scour Airbnb and see that they don't have a permit or they haven't gotten their, inspection or safety permits. I have to have other sources in order to be able to enforce the ability to apply a permit if we allow it in that area. Midway, Garden City, some examples of ones that are interesting how they approach short-term rentals. It seems throughout the state our resort communities approach it a little different than our regular non-resort communities just because of housing stock and supply for seasonal workers. But you could also ask us for other examples that might be germane to you. Two great resources. Utah State University has this incredible course and resources on understanding and managing short-term rentals. Really, I think, helpful to not only educate yourself about the options and what you can do, but what others are doing. And this is a little sample of what they have in that course. They talk about it. They talk about data. They talk about ordinances. They talk about the tax implications and other things that you need to do on that end. So I really suggest that if that's an issue in your community or if you just want to learn more, you can pursue that area. And then Karson, I think there's a question in the chat there about the other listing sites. I'm going to ask you to punt on that while I continue through, so we'll answer that. So we had a very high level review of conditional use permits, subdivisions, short-term rentals. After Karson talks a little bit about housing resources that are available throughout the state for all of us to look at and consider and think, we'll end up with talking a little bit about the different resources that you will have to be able to continue to navigate these issues. So Karson, if you're ready, I will turn the baton over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Meg. And I know housing is everybody's favorite topic. I know that some of you ran because there was not enough housing in your community. Some ran because there's now become too much housing in your community. Some ran because there was not enough affordable housing. Some ran because there was too much rental housing. It's a major component in our world, and it takes up much of our legislative agendas. Those of you who I see some familiar faces online, and you will know that many of our legislative policy committees spend a substantial amount of time on housing. So I wanted to just kind of provide a little bit of context on what you can and can't do to try to achieve more housing affordability, if that's your policy preference, and talk through some of the tools that the state legislature has created. So, Meg, can you go to the next slide? So, for context, and I'm kind of benching this in a little bit of the legislative side, partly because that's most of my role at the league, but also partly because this is what really there's been a kind of a pinch point between us and local governments in the state over what the proper role of local governments is and planning is in providing housing. And you can see here, this is from the most recent Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute report. Between 2015, all across the board, median housing price was $229,000 in 2015. 10 years later, that's more than doubled to $506,500. I know in some of your communities that's high, some of your communities that's really low, but that's kind of the statewide picture that a lot of state policymakers are seeing. I also like to point out that local governments have issued more building permits in the last couple of years than ever before in state history. And I think that's an important point to not be forgotten either. We are entering somewhat of a cooling period in the housing market, so we're starting to see fewer permits pulled, but this is going to be, you'll hear us talking a lot about this, and you should expect it to be a big part of our policy conversations going forward. But again, this is just a little bit of context about what the state is seeing overall. Meg, can you go to the next slide? So our legislature and many of our state leaders have generally taken the approach that the best policy solution to housing affordability is more supply. There was a push a couple of years ago from the Property Rights Coalition to restrict inclusionary zoning, with the rationale being that if applied improperly, I think inclusionary zoning has had a sort of mixed balance across the country, depending on where you are. Where some communities have been a really impactful and effective tool, in other communities it has sort of constrained the housing supply. But our legislature decided to restrict local governments from basically like a hard mandate for providing inclusionary zoning. And what I mean by that is this would be a policy in your base zoning that says you must dedicate, say, 10% of the housing in the project you're proposing to sorry, I see there's a comment that somebody's not seeing the slides. We're seeing them, but we'll also share them afterwards if you're not able to see them. Anyway, on the back to inclusionary zoning, but that's what a policy would look like, is saying if you want to bring a proposal, maybe for an apartment complex, you have to have 10% of that dedicated to this income threshold. These policies are tricky to get right. Legislature just basically said if you want to try to restrict or require more affordability or an affordable component to your project, it has to be done through agreement, whether that's a written development agreement, whether that's an incentive like an overlay, whether it's additional city funding. It has to be a sort of meeting of the minds between the development or the applicant and the local government. So you can't just require it, it has to be incentivized. By written agreement, I mean a development agreement. Okay, Meg, can you go to the next slide? So, what we've tried to do, because what we hear from our board of directors and from many local governments, is that they're seeing a lot of housing being built. Much of it is a either rental stock, or much of it is higher end product, and communities who are sort of taking the political risk in approving new housing, controversial housing projects, then they feel like they're not actually getting the sort of starter home product or the price point that they desire. So what we've tried to do to fit that prohibition in state law at the state level is create policy tools to help local governments achieve this outcome, to basically provide incentives, recognizing that most of you don't have general fund dollars that you can just dedicate to write down the cost of a project. So I know some of you are familiar with tax increment financing. Some of this is a new concept, but the general idea behind tax increment financing is that you are you're saying we have an area that we want to either develop or redevelop. The property values are relatively low now, or it's not generating much property tax now. We think with some investment, we'll be able to increase that to a higher point than the market would otherwise bear. And basically, you're issuing debt up front to pay for some kind of enhancements in that area, whether it's additional infrastructure or just other community enhancements to increase that final value beyond what it would have been initially. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but that's the gist of it. So it's essentially a way to say we want, with some targeted investment, we want some enhanced outcome, and this is a way of financing that going forward. So there's a couple different tools that I'm going to talk about that are in this space. I'm not going to talk about community reinvestment areas, which are a long-standing tax increment tool, typically not used for housing, but they can be used for housing in certain circumstances. So Meg, can you go to the next one? All right. So there's three sort of newish tools that we've been sort of working on and implementing the last couple of years. The first tool was the Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zone. We have several of these that have been created. We have several of these that are being proposed, and there's tens of thousands of housing units centered around transit now in the pipeline that would not have occurred but for this tool. So this tool has been really successful. I'll talk in a little bit more details in a moment, but this is a tool really designed for higher intensity development around transit. It's totally optional for the city. It's initiated by the city. So it's a tool, not a requirement. Following the success of that tool, we've created two additional ones. The first being the First Home Investment Zone, or FIZ, and then the other one being the Homeownership Promotion Zone, or HOPS. The FIZ is really designed around center development. Many of your communities, if you're on the Wasatch Front, or if you're in the Mountain Land Association of Government, if you're in one of those two areas, you've been working with them and probably have been working on what we're calling community or town centers. So a center could be anything from a high density transit stop if you're in an urban context, or it could just be a small area, maybe around a commercial center or a park in a smaller community, and the density wouldn't look anywhere near that high, but it might be slightly higher than the surrounding area. Centers are a great way to invest strategically in your community, to plan for higher intensity development where the area can support it. So it's not saying density growth everywhere. It's saying we've identified, whether it's in your general plan, whether it's in your zoning code, we've identified areas where we think it's appropriate to have more development, whether it's residential, commercial, but it's strategic and targeted. So the First Home Investment Zone is a tool designed to help facilitate that outcome by pairing revenue from tax increment financing with your local planning. The Homeownership Promotion Zone is sort of a smaller tool, recognizing not everybody has the resources to go through the process for a first home investment zone, or maybe has the infrastructure to support that, or maybe your community, you might be a small town and it just doesn't really fit, period. So the Homeownership Promotion Zone is the smallest of the tools. It has to be under 10 contiguous acres. It has to be at least 6 units to the acre. So I know if you're from a small town, that might be a lot, but in many communities, that's not a tremendously intense density, and it might be less than what you're looking at already. Maybe can you go to the next? So the cool thing about all of these tools is it gives you the ability through this incentive to work with a developer to get towards the outcomes of housing affordability. And I know there's a lot of text on these slides and they're kind of intense. So we'll send out the slides. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the details here, but you can sort of review them later, and you can reach out if you have additional questions. But the Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zone, again, this is the sort of highest intensity tool. It allows the city to create this program, and it allows the city to require pretty intensive, and even the statute requires pretty intensive income targets for like truly affordable housing, not just market rate housing. Much of this housing is probably going to be rental stock, but there are some new requirements for ownership stock. One other important piece of this beyond the funding, in a traditional tax increment financing model, through a CRA, you have to get sign off from other taxing entities, including school districts, counties, And with the housing and transit reinvestment zone, if you can demonstrate that you're meeting the requirements in the statute and the ideas, goals in the statute, then you can actually get approval from this state entity to go ahead with the project. The school districts and other taxing entities do have some representation on the board, and they have voted in support of most of these proposed projects. But you can basically, if you have a project that everybody's really excited about, except for one taxing entity, this is a way to get that project to move forward without them signing off. All right, Meg, can you go to the next one? So the first time investment zone is a little more complicated, but it's sort of the similar model where you get fairly intensive tax increment revenue to be able to support this. The income targets are a little bit higher, so maybe a little bit more like 80 to 120% of area median income, more sort of the traditional starter home model. One interesting thing about this is you can count both the area in the center, like in the area that you've designated as the first home investment zone. But then if you have additional suburban growth around that, or elsewhere in your city, you can actually count that towards the project as well. So it gives the city a lot of flexibility if they're looking at doing this center development to try to balance the new growth with providing new homeownership opportunities for younger families or lower income families in your city. Then Meg, can you go to the next one? So in the homeownership promotion zone may be more broadly applicable. Again, it's smaller, it's less than 10 contiguous acres. The income targets are a little bit higher, so at least 80% of AMI. They have to be restricted for at least 5 years. And it has to be at least 6 units to the acre of density. Or if it's already 6 units to the acre or more, then it has to be half a unit per acre beyond that. So if it's already zoned 8 units per acre, you could say we're going to zone it at 9 units per acre and you'll qualify for the tax increment financing. I will caution here that there's not a lot of tax increment generated from low density residential development because the state homestead exemption on residential property, so it doesn't generate as much, period. But again, this is sort of a tool to help a city and developer who are just at an impasse say, the city can say, we want more affordable owner-occupied product. The developer can say, we can't make that pencil unless we get additional revenue for infrastructure or whatever it needs for the project. So this is a tool to sort of bridge that gap when you have a willing city and a willing developer to get that outcome of more affordable ownership housing. Then Meg, can you go to the next one? Awesome. And I know there's probably a lot of questions in the chat room, but we'll share slides again and you can reach out if you have any additional questions. So Meg, can you go to the next slide? So I wanted to talk a little bit about moderate income housing plans because these have sort of been built into the moderate income housing plan framework. All communities with the population in the urban area with the population of over 5,000 have to comply with this requirement. This has been on the books for a very long time, decades. And then in 2019, the legislature said we want to make these plans a little bit more meaningful. And they went through and selected a number of strategies, planning strategies that a city or town had to select. Again, general plans are aspirational in the state of Utah, so it's not a mandate, but you are required to, if you're one of these communities, to include this in your general plan and work towards implementation of the plan. So there's 29 possible strategies right now, and I'm going to put a big asterisk on this that there's potentially legislation that could significantly change this or not change this at all. We're sort of still waiting to see what happens in a couple weeks here, but this could all be a very different landscape in a couple weeks in the legislative session. So I'm just sort of presenting on what the current law is, and if you follow along with our legislative policy committee, we'll keep you apprised of any changes. But basically, state law right now lists 29 possible strategies ranging from city incentives to upzoning to includes all of these tax increment tools and overlays. There's a really broad range that can really fit any community's need. And then again, communities have latitude on implementing those. Meg, can you go to the next one? So one piece of this, if you're a city with transit, you are required to do station area plans for your fixed rail transit areas. So what does that mean? That means a front runner stop. That means a UTA track stop or bus rapid transit. It's not every bus stop. It's only if you have something enhanced like bus rapid transit where there's some fixed corridor. But you are required to do a station area plan for those. That's part of this moderate income housing plan framework. And then that includes some strategies like an HTRZ or some other targeted strategies for facilitating housing in those areas. And maybe housing that's designed for residents who don't need as much parking, maybe a senior living facility, or something along that effect. But still, cities implementing has legislative flexibility to do that. The other thing that happened last year was House Bill 37, which created a quote unquote homeownership submenu, where the legislature has said some of these specific tools we think are more impactful than others. And so rather than having to adopt three strategies for your, or five strategies for your moderate income housing plan, depending on how large you are, you could basically just implement one of these, either one of these new tools or a qualifying single family homeownership density bonus or a qualifying multifamily homeownership density bonus. Some of you may be wondering what a density bonus is. The basic idea is either through your zoning code or it could be a standalone policy. You say, we are willing to, on the front end, say we're going to give a land use applicant more density than they're otherwise entitled to, but they can only qualify that if they meet certain parameters. That might be deed restrictions for owner occupancy. That might be deed restrictions for affordability. You have a lot of latitude in defining what your community's housing need is, and then you can balance that according to the policy. But again, this is one of those tools where it's not, you don't necessarily have the ability to require as a base condition of approval that a applicant includes more affordability in their project, but it basically builds in an incentive for you to be able to trade off a little bit more density for that outcome you want. And it doesn't have to be density, but that's usually the most practical way to get at that outcome. So um, let's see. I think there's one more slide here, Meg. Um, there you go. Sorry, go back one to the Mill Creek example. So we've been working, we have a housing advisory committee. Once you've become elected or appointed, if you'd like to be participating in that, please let us know. But we've been spotlighting a bunch of different things that different communities are doing to try to achieve their housing goals. These are all different. We have sort of a mantra here that one size misfits all, especially in the housing space. Your community's housing needs are different. Your community's assets, whether it's how much open space you have or how many resources you have or how much capacity there is for new growth, that all varies. But what we've been trying to do is spotlight communities who are trying new things, who are trying to use the tools that they have to get to the outcomes that their council and planning commission want. And there's sort of a balance, but we just provided a quick example of Mill Creek. We've got a bunch of other examples if you'd like to learn more, but we just wanted to give a quick overview on ways that your community can, or ways your council can try to get more affordable housing, or maybe make the new housing stock a little bit more affordable or try to steer it towards ownership. So I know that's a quick overview of a very long and very dense subject, but we're happy to answer any more questions after we wrap up the presentation here in a moment.
Thank you, Carson. Yeah, and I just want to mention that I know we have lots of different sizes of cities and towns on here, and even though certain cities and towns are exempt housing, I think these are tools that can be applied even if you don't have the requirement under the state. Like some of these could work or be thought through in your community. And this is one why we thought the Mill Creek example was sort of interesting there, because they just took the tools that they could and laid out a framework and sort of said, okay, developers, here's what we'll offer. This is what we can do on our end. And if you look at that, obviously it's a big urban city, but they had height, the density, which Karson explained, open space. So, I mean, that was must have been a requirement that they had in there, that they said they could work with you on that. The planning fees always, and then parking. So not applicable to every area, but maybe one or two of these are incentives or things to think about when you want to get a certain type of development. The other thing that's really interesting, and we'll have actually a video of a program that we did a few years ago called Your Land, Your Plan. And it talks about how to look at any municipal assets or city-owned land. So even if you have a small parcel, what is the best use for that? Obviously, you have incredible leverage when you own the land and have some public policy goals that you want to overlay on that. And that website will be on the resource page that we have at the end here. but it's on the Strong Towns website. And it's a module course that we set up, and it just talks about how to develop policy around using city-owned assets. So something to sort of think about and consider as you walk through that issue with housing, whatever it may be in your community. So, Land Use Academy of Utah, I mentioned this in our Saturday sessions, but again, an incredible resource that I ask you to take a look at. It's one of a kind in the state of Utah with land use resources. Toolkits exist on there, videos exist on there, terminologies of zoning. We did a 15-minute video on general plan. Often planning commissioners or even councils maybe play these at the beginning of a work session just to get everybody on the same page and also to help satisfy that 4-hour annual requirement of training for planning commissioners. Lots of toolkits on there as well. One being in this term that you may have heard or may have not heard, but missing middle. What is that? To me, it's basically, so, we have sort of the big subdivisions, we have sort of single family infill, and maybe that's where this falls. But this toolkit that was created for Utah with a grant from the state is really looks at what tools we can use in our community and area. So it's nice because it's not necessarily a national tool. And then it has videos, examples, sample ordinances, and just talks about the context of what that would mean in your community. And again, it's a statewide tool. So I suggest maybe take a look at that on the Luau site. And again, that might be another opportunity for you to do in a work session. This QR code will take you to a training resource page. And we've put links of different websites on there. We've also listed areas where you can go for conferences. The American Planning Association holds 2 conferences that are very heavy on land use. Our conferences, spring and fall, that I know Molly has talked about and we talk about later. We also have sessions on land use. The Utah Land Use Institute is what I like to call the 301 or 401 sort of lawyer level land use resource that also holds conferences twice a year that get into really heavy issues like impact fees, exactions. So there's a range of opportunities, whether you're starting fresh or whether you really want to know about the criteria on impact fees available to you. And this is a starting resource page for you to look at that. And we can also, again, direct you to a resource if we can't answer the question ourselves on our staff here at the League for you. So we're getting toward the end. I see, Molly, that there's some couple of questions in the chat that maybe are being answered. If there are, I don't know, Molly, if anyone has a question, if they want to raise their hand or just put one in the chat, what we'd like to do at this point. We do have a hand raised. Okay.
Yeah, we have some great questions in the chat, so let's start there. So
Okay.
a lot are focused around density and zoning. So can you just speak a little bit about what the exact density limitations exist? And there's, I think, just a general, I'm going through these kind of a concern of like a perpetual perceived increase of density. Do you ever limit density? And what do you do with perceived or real home values for people when density comes to knocking?
So let's go back to that zoning code. So where you set your districts, your zoning districts. So you'll have single family, commercial, mixed use maybe, which would be a variety of commercial and residential. Those are where you set the vision through that general plan for what kind of levels of development you want. And that's what we're talking about with density. So we have like, in residential zone, you could have lower residential densities, in other words, smaller lot size, or you could have a zone where it's agricultural and it's very large lot size, but allows residential. So density just indicates what policy decision you've decided to set at the local level, and what the state and others are asking us to do is to say, hey, in those areas that make sense for you, whether it's a downtown core, whether it's a main street, where can you look at creating more housing opportunities? And is increased density a tool that you could offer to get there? Karson, did you want to add on to that at all? Or
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Megan. I don't mean to say that we're not trying to say that you like necessarily should or shouldn't increase density. Just explain how that can be a tool for getting a specific outcome. I also see the question. I don't know that I would characterize zoning limitations as a contract with existing homeowners any more than any other city ordinance or policy is a contract with existing residents. I certainly see why residents are concerned about additional growth, but I think it's important that that power remains in the legislative body, the city council. And let's see. So I didn't really talk about decreasing or limiting density because that's sort of a separate discussion that may or may not impact housing availability in your community. I do think there are some, depending on how much you're restricting it, there are some planning implications, some infrastructure implications, some long-term revenue implications that should all be considered. But again, I think that's a local decision. You have some authority to do that, but you have to be careful not to lower it to the extent that you create any sort of takings issues with existing applications or anything. So we can try to cover that maybe going forward, but I'd say, like Meg said, that's part of your zoning decision.
yeah, and I think the higher level sort of discussion about housing is it's providing a range of opportunities in your community, right? So are you providing a range for folks who want to buy their first home? Are you providing it just for seniors? Are you providing it for families with children? Are you what is that range? What is that housing choice in your community? And taking another look at what you could do, what zoning tools you could do to enhance one or two or several of those areas, whatever that decision is at the legislative level. Now, the moderate income housing plan for those cities that are required to do it have to take some action. And so for the rest of us, it's a consideration for those moderate income housing plan areas. It's a working within that framework that Karson laid out of strategies. Molly, I'll look to you to see where we want to head next.
Yeah, I think we have a hand raised from Andrew. Andrew, if you could plug your question in the chat just so we can, I'm trying to go through all of them together. There's a question about the emergence of some of the districts we're seeing. So different authority districts. Is it true that authority districts can levy taxes and don't have to abide by city or county law?
So I can take this one, Meg. It depends on what the authority districts are. So basically, the state, if it is state-owned land, they have supremacy over local decision making. They still, if they're connecting to your infrastructure, they'll still need to meet the standards for that connection. But that gets a little bit tricky. Something like a public infrastructure district or a special service district would still have to meet the city standards, density, land use regulations, all of that. Something, if you're referring to more of something like an inland port, or some of the like a MIDA property, some of those have their sort of special beasts. They do have some limited taxing authorities, but they're not, aside from, well, I should take that back. They're a bit of a different beast. Some of them do have some limited land use authority, but yeah, a little bit of a separate beast.
And then Molly, I saw two in there that I'll just address quickly. One, someone was looking at doing sort of a housing department or creating something. And I'll tell you that Park City has the longest record of providing affordable housing and how just range of housing opportunities in the state. And they have a housing department, and they might be a good person to talk to. Heber City has also been very active, just doing that within their own planning staff. So you may talk to them. And then we had a question about accessory dwelling units. And so Karson can talk a little bit about that. We have some legislative precursors of some movement in in that arena. Karson.
Yeah, so state law already addresses what's called an internal accessory dwelling unit. Basically, it's a maybe more commonly known as like a granny flat or a basement apartment. The idea being there that it's not modifying the footprints at all. It's not expanding it. It's not changing it. But if you have say if you have a basement property, state law sort of preempts us to some degree there. You can still require business licenses for that. But unless your city had, by the deadline back in 2022, carved out a certain portion of the city to not allow internal accessory dwelling units there. Those are allowed by right. Again, we can get into a little more details if you'd like to follow up with me, but there's what we're calling detached accessory dwelling units, which is sort of the more traditional I think traditionally what people think of, and that would be like a separate accessory apartment that's maybe in your backyard. Those cities still retain authority for those. There is going to be a bill this coming session that will require urban cities to have a policy um, to govern those. So basically, a policy to allow them. It'll leave a lot of latitude to cities, to legislative bodies to determine what the parameters are. I don't have a ton more details than that, but stay tuned because we'll be talking a lot about accessory dwelling units this coming session.
Great. So I don't see any other questions. And I guess, Andrew, did we get your question? I'm sorry if we didn't or did, or here,
Oh,
here it is right here. Great.
here it is. Yeah.
Write it in.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so if everyone can see that. So what is the legal basis or solid grounds for denying zone changes or conditional use permit code changes proposed by developers through staff? Okay, so let's unpack those two. For a zone change, we're in that legislative lane. So you have the greatest flexibility in that lane to decide whether you want to do that zone change or not. Typically, codes show some kind of bumpers or parameters. So in other words, it doesn't meet the general plan. There's health, safety, welfare issues. So typically the findings can be broad, but most councils, when they deny a zone change, list some findings or reasons as to why, but that legislative discretion is still very broad and upheld by the courts. Karson, did you want to add anything to that legislative question before I hit to? So conditional use permits are very different. And that is, again, you would be looking at your code, and I assume the question is someone proposes to do a change to your code. I guess it's somewhat different, but not different. It's different in the sense that you have an existing code and they're asking to change it. You still have that legislative discretion. There are processes that you need to follow. The public hearing by the Planning Commission, they recommend an advisory opinion up to the council, and then the council has the ultimate say on amendment of that code. So still in the legislative arena, but you always want to sort of have some kind of findings or basis to tie it back to some larger goals for the community. And then what is our authority over land use on a city council? So city council is designated as the person in charge of land use by the state under that Land Use Development and Management Act. And then they can, and we had this, and the slides I think are available, Molly had said from our training last Saturday, talks about the different roles of the Planning Commission and land use authorities. So I'm gonna skip over that for a second. And then your next one is a subjective opinion enough? I think we've asked that that subjectivity has to be somewhat tied to the larger goals and visions of the city. I think it can't be just we don't like it, go away type of thing. Karson.
Meg, can I jump in there too? And I think there's an important distinction between denying a rezone and denying an application that's consistent with your code. That's where a lot of cities, I think, find themselves in trouble if the zoning already says you can build to X density and they get an application maybe it's been 10 years since that zoning rezone was done, but they get an application for a big project that is at that density and then say, we've had a lot of resident pushback, we don't want to do this. Once that right has been given, you can't really unwind that neatly. So that's one thing to be aware of. The other thing I want to just a note of caution here is that we have fought very hard over the last couple of years to retain the maximum amount of local legislative authority possible, particularly in the land use arena. Um, we do hear all the time from state legislators, from even some federal policymakers now. We cities are only responsive to quote unquote public clamor. That's I don't like that term. I think it's kind of derogatory towards like the public saying what they want in their community. But that is a common narrative. I would be very, or I don't know, it's you have legislative discretion. I'm not saying what you should or shouldn't do, but I would just be aware that anytime you on a record say we're denying this because we've had residents oppose it, that will become a state political, like you will be singled out at the state level. We will do our best to defend that decision, but just beware. There's a lot of eyes watching all of those land use changes. Again, you have the authority to do it. Just be mindful of the sort of outside parameters around it. I do think I think it's an easier basis to defend if it's inconsistent with the general plan, if it's has like other objective criteria, makes right. It is a legislative decision, but just beware that it is yeah, everything is connected.
Mhm.
And then I think maybe Molly, one more from Chris from Smithfield.
Yeah, let's do one more and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay. And this question is about providing more than just rental units, and there absolutely is a push for home ownership. And I wanted to stress again, if you're fortunate enough to have city-owned parcels, that is one way you could direct the outcome of that project if you partnered with a developer. And Park City again has done that and is doing that, and a good example to look for. Karson, I'll let you also chat about that.
Yeah, I think most of the tools that I talked about would be appropriate for trying to get to ownership as well. Deed restrictions are usually the most common tool. So whether it's a density bonus, whether it's a development agreement, whatever, you're still going to need to give some incentive rather than requiring ownership outright. So what it probably look like is we will either if we are planning on giving an upzone, we will do that, but we're going to ask for some consideration from the applicant to include deed restrictions for a certain portion of them to be owner occupied. You'll have to work that all out on a case by case basis. What makes sense for your council, what makes sense for your community, what makes sense for the application, because you also don't want it to go so far that it kills the project and you don't get anything built that you want. So deed restrictions can be a little bit tricky. If you have I would reach out to maybe your association of government, if they have any kind of recommendations or programs that might help you with setting up deed restrictions, because you still have to, well, somebody, whether it's a housing authority, the property owner, whoever, there still needs to be some enforcement mechanism. Sometimes that's done through an HOA, but deed restrictions are a little bit complicated. But I think those are probably the best mechanism to try to get ownership. Because that's again something we've really been trying to prioritize is not just affordability, but affordable ownership, so younger generations can get on the property ladder.
And to ensure long-term affordability. So if there is a city investment put into the project, that you have that long-term vision. So Karson, thank you. Molly, thank you. Thank you to everyone who took time out of your day. Again, we are available. Our website has all of our emails to contact us, and we super appreciate what you do for your communities, and congratulations to those of you that have just been elected and will take office in January, and thank you on behalf of the league.